In this section of the lesson, we're going to have a look at counters, and you can access counters in the same place as timers, but in the counter operations folder. So CTU for count up. We'll drop this in and we get the same thing as we did with the timers, which is the call options for single instance because we're in OB1. And this is a very basic interface, very similar to a TON. We have the CU for count up, the Q for done, the CV for the current count value. We have an R for reset, and we have a PV for the target value or the preset value. So I'm going to set this to 10. And on the front here, I'm going to put our bools B1. I'm going to leave reset as, actually I will put bools B2 on the reset. Just a little tip in case I haven't shown this already, but you can click here and then click the normally open contact to create a sort of network here if you need to put more on here. And that you can do that with any Boolean interface element, so long as you can get back to this left-hand rail. And on the output, let's put B2. And just so to demonstrate, if I put numbers I1 on here, our current value will be stored in I1. So let's get this downloaded. So now that we're online, just quickly, I changed this to B3, not B2. Otherwise, it will reset as soon as it finishes. But if I increment this, set it to true, we can see that the counter counts up by one value. It doesn't do it every single scan, otherwise it would be running away right now because every scan it would increment. So it's looking for a rising edge. So we're counting up every single time CU becomes true, and CU must go false in order to count again. And just like the timers, we are looking for PV to equal CV, or for CV to be greater than PV. So if I continue to increment this, all the way up to 10, 7, 8, 9, on this 10th count, Q would become true. And I can continue to count and Q stays on. But if B3 goes true, we reset to 0. And if B1, which is our count up, goes true, notice that we don't count. And that's because the reset wins. And also it's worth noting that with B1 set to true, if B3 goes false, we don't count. So unlike timers, which would immediately start timing, we don't actually count up because we didn't see the rising edge whilst the reset was active. So now I've changed the PV to a variable that we can change whilst it's running. And let's have a look at what happens if we have the same scenario that we have with the timers, where we change the numerical value once we've already started to count something. So if I set this to true, and we set the CV to 3, remember we were at 10 at the beginning, and I change this to 5. If I then increment up to 5, we go true. If I come up to 7, and then we set this back to 10, we go false. If these values change, it doesn't matter about the state of CU. It will still output a true value. For example, if I set this back to false, and then I change this value to 7, the output comes on because now our counter has hit its preset value. So much more straightforward than timers. Let's have a quick look at the countdown. And I'll just send this to the PLC, but notice that it disconnected this. Let's reconnect that. And I'll send this down to the PLC. So now we have a countdown timer which starts at a value and counts backwards. So if I pulse this one here, we can see that we're counting down from 10. So if I do LD, which is load, which loads the PV into the CV, we can see that goes back to 10. And if I have that as true and I pulse our CD for countdown, notice that it doesn't count down because, like the reset, effectively this is a reset. It wins over the countdown input. So turn that off and count all the way down to 10. And on the last one, we go true. So let's have a look at the final type, which is our CTUD. And it's effectively just a count up and count down. So if I put on this one B4, and on this one I'll put B5, and you have a count up output and also a count down output. Notice that I can't put a coil on here, so unlike the inputs where I'm able to put the actual symbol, can't do that on the countdown because you're not allowed to set more than one power rail for an output. So I have to just type it in. Pools B3, not B3, sorry, B6. And let's send this to the PLC. And now what we have is a count up and count down counter. So we can see that right now with the internal value set to 0, the counter value set to 0, then we have a PV or our target value of 10. We can see that the QD, which is our downwards counter, is true and up is false. If I increment this, you can see straight away because we're not at 0 anymore, QD is now false. And once I get up to 10, QU will go true. And then these reset and load work exactly the same way as they did in their previous counters. If I reset, we go back to 0. And if I load, we go to 10. This is our countdown CD. You can see that it's counting down. And just be aware that count up is still on, but we're still counting down. And that's because we're rising edge protected. So they would have to both be on exactly the same scan in order for one of them to be deemed as the winner. So let's have a look at what happens in that case by setting CD to B1 as well. So I've now set B1 and let's turn it off. So our value is 4 at the moment. Turn them off. If I turn them both on, nothing happens. So they effectively cancel each other out. So it's not possible to end up in a situation where you count up and down on exactly the same scan and one of them have priority over the other. That's just something subtle and important, I guess, to know how this is going to work if that happens. But the chances of that happening are very small because there's no real benefit to ever doing this.